Thank you, brother. Appreciate it. We're going to cover chapter 25 and 26 of Genesis, so if you want to be turning to chapter 25, we'll spend a little bit more time in 25 than 26. We'll see how the content goes, how deep we dive into 26, but we'll probably end up just recapping 26. But we'll get started in chapter 25, Genesis 25, verse 1. We're kind of, Sarah has just passed and is buried. We went through that on Sunday. No, 2 weeks ago. 1 week ago. 1 week ago. And so we're catching up on kind of Abraham's other affairs here. Now Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. She bore to him Zinran and Jokshan and Medan and Midian and Ishbak and Shua. Jokshan became the father of Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim and Letushim and Lumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah and Epher and Hanok and Abida and Eldah. All of these were the sons of Keturah. Now Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts while he was still living and sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the land of the east. So Abraham has more children through concubines like Ishmael, and as with Ishmael, he sends them away. Why does he send them away?
They're not heirs.
Yeah, they're not heirs. They were not going to be heirs, and so by sending them away, it kind of clarifies that Isaac would be the only heir to Abraham. Important note to remember: the children of concubines didn't have the status of legitimate heirs. They typically had the status of servants or slaves in the household, and they were part of the inheritance, not recipients of it. So Abraham sends them away, but he also sends them away with freedoms and with gifts. So this is kind of an unusually generous thing that Abraham is doing for these children. I'm looking for this clicker. Didn't grab it beforehand. Sorry about that. Of these children mentioned, the one to note is Midian. Midian becomes the chief of the tribe that develops from all these sons. Midian's descendants settled east of the Gulf of Aqaba and ranged north to areas east of the Dead Sea and the Jordan. I'm not sure how great this map is or how clear this is. I think we have a pointer on here, but I'll probably mess this up somehow. But this Gulf, straight from the Dead Sea and Jordan down, that's the Gulf of Aqaba. So they settled to the east and kind of all the way north from there. They were nomadic people, and at least one of them settled in the southern half of the Sinai Peninsula. We see these Midianites come back a couple times in the Old Testament. When Moses fled from Egypt, he lived with a family of Midianites and married Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, who was a priest. And the Midianites were enemies of the Israelites throughout most of their history. They'll fight the Midianites near the end of the 40 years in the wilderness, and again during the days of Gideon. So just a little bit of highlight here from what these people become and how they factor in future later on in the story. Verse 7 and 8, these are all the years of Abraham's life that he lived, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a ripe old age, an old man and satisfied with life, and he was gathered to his people. So let's take a minute here and really want to hear from you guys. I know I've made a few comments along the way, but we've spent a better part of a month and a half talking about Abraham and his life and the things that he's done and the life that he's led. So what are your takeaways on the life of Abraham for the things we've talked about?
Man of great faith, but he was flawed as well.
Yeah. Man of great faith, but had his flaws.
He wandered land. He didn't have a permanent home.
Didn't have a permanent home. He just kind of wandered continually, or wandered throughout the land and didn't settle. What else do you take away from Abraham? Yeah, Mike?
Even though he didn't have a permanent home and was nomadic, he was still very, very hospitable.
He was very hospitable even though he didn't have a home. Nomadic, yep. Renee?
I think it's interesting he said he was an old man and satisfied with life.
Yeah.
That's kind of rare sometimes.
An old man is satisfied with life. Yeah, it can be a rarity, right? But what a good life, and something I think that we'd like to shoot for, right? Being satisfied with life and satisfied with service. What else strikes you about the life of Abraham? Yep.
It amazes me his faith
Faith without what?
Without having a complete picture.
The whole picture.
What the expectation was for him, the promise that would come, but he didn't get that fulfilled like we get to read about it, but he had that faith.
Yeah, of all the promises that were promised to him, I mean, what did he really get to see? His son, right? That he would have a descendant, right? But that the rest of the promise would come through the descendant, right? So he wouldn't get to sit back and live and see all those things that was promised, and still had faith about it. In trying circumstances too, right? I mean, what was going on in the land? I mean, there was famine in the land. There were conflicts with other tribes or people. Several times we talked about that.
He usually tried to avoid conflicts, but when he didn't, and it was unavoidable, he usually let his opponent kind of set the rules for how it was going to be figured out.
Okay. Yep. Anything that comes to mind in particular with that? Yeah, Lot, for one. Let Lot kind of dictate the terms of what Lot wanted to do, right? I don't think he was one to actively participate in the conflict, right? Absolutely. These are all good things. Anybody else think of anything about Abraham?
I think if you look at Hebrews 11 chapter, the Hebrew writer spends most of the time with the text on Abraham. And it's fitting because he looked for a city whose builder and founder was God.
Yeah, this is a perfect transition to the kind of my next thing that I wanted to mention here. And the last part of this verse talked about Abraham being gathered to his people. What do you make of that? What do you think that means?
Well, it says he's the father of the faithful. I think he was joined to the faithful.
Yeah, we see this gathered to his people several times throughout the Old Testament. I think it would be very easy to say, okay, he died and was gathered to his people, so he was buried with his people. But there really was only one person that he could have been buried with, and that's Sarah. So I don't think that she qualifies as his people. And in Hebrews 11, Steve mentioned it, starting in verse 13. Hebrews 11, verse 13. Right before this, the Hebrew writer talks about the faith of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah. And he says, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. I think this points that they had belief in a life after earthly life, right? That they had something to look forward to. And we already know that Enoch was taken without death. And I think that they had the belief that there would be a life that existed with the faithful after their death. And again, this gathered to his people, we'll see this again for Ishmael shortly, but it's also mentioned Isaac, Jacob, Aaron, and Moses were all gathered to their people. Thoughts on this?
It sounds really peaceful to me.
Sounds peaceful?
It sounds like somebody's just coming and gathering them up.
Yeah, to be with people that you want to be with, right? What did you say? Sorry?
So that's what we all hope for. We want to be with our loved ones.
Yeah, our loved ones in the faith. Josh?
I don't know if this has any bearing on what Steve said or not, but Abraham being the father of the faithful, and then the whether it be parable or true story that Jesus tells of the rich man and Lazarus, and where is it that Lazarus is gathered to upon death? It is Abraham's bosom. So that place of the faithful going, Abraham is signified that. And I hate to give credit to Steve for.
I know, I was about to say, how is this going to work out if you're commenting on Steve's stuff and you're not up here to own the podium, if you will, right? But yeah, I mean, so, and the other part of it is not just in burial, but we already talked about how Abraham didn't own land, right? So there would have been his people, he was not around his people, right? In general, they were strangers in that land. So yeah, I think this points us to them believing in another life after a life here on earth. Other comments? Sorry, I didn't want to move on too quick. Yeah. Kurt.
It's interesting to see Isaac and Ishmael reunited here.
Yep.
To bury their father. Even as it says, I don't know
Yeah, possibly. And certainly was, for at least for a time, brought up in Abraham's house, right? So, yeah, we don't know the circumstances of how, if there was a needed reconciliation or not, right? But yeah, they are here together burying Abraham. So, and we'll go ahead and read verses 9 through 11. Then his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried with Sarah his wife. It came about after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac lived by Beer Lahai Roi. So yeah, Isaac and Ishmael are here together. Again, not sure what the circumstances are that drive that. I would think certainly kudos to Ishmael for, if nothing else, recognizing, respecting his upbringing and the teaching of Abraham. Again, don't know if there was any conflict that was a part of their coming together that needed to be resolved or not. Yeah. Other comments or thoughts here? We might get to 26 after all. The details of the blessing from God to Isaac will come later on in chapter 26. We'll cover that shortly. So, verse 12. Now these are the records of the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maid, bore to Abraham. And these are the names of the sons of Ishmael, by their names in the order of their birth. I didn't practice these ahead of time, so we're just going to roll with it, right? Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, and Kedar, and Adbeel, and Mibsam, and Mishma, and Duma, and Massa, Hadad, and Tema, Jeter, Naphish, and Kedeman. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names, by their villages and by their camps, 12 princes according to their tribes. So we have this really short and detailed overview of Ishmael's family. Why do you think this is mentioned here? Fulfillment of the promise. Yeah, I think it does highlight exactly how God fulfilled his promise to Hagar in Genesis 21:18, which it says, "For I will make a great nation of him." Why else might it be there? Certainly to highlight that God keeps his promises, right, to the people that would hear this story. Why else might it be there?
Typically deals with the unimportant genealogy.
Yeah, it kind of ties it up and we move on.
It's all about the seed or the offspring.
Right. So, I mean, it ties up the story of Ishmael here. I don't know that we have any more mentions specifically in part of the active story here, but clears up again that God keeps his promises and that we're kind of done and we're ready to get back to the lineage where the promises would be fulfilled. Questions, thoughts? Yep.
12 sons, but 12 princes too. So they were of stature. And I thought it was interesting too that they had 12 tribes also. We'll see 12 tribes later on.
Yeah, we do. Yep, very interesting. Other thoughts or comments? I always like to pause. I don't want to walk over anybody who wants to say something. Right? But even if it's awkward sometimes. No, yeah, you would, right? Verses 17 and 18. These are the years in life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. They settled from Havilah to Shur, which is east of Egypt, as one goes towards Assyria. He settled in defiance of his relatives. I'm sorry, I haven't been advancing the slides here. Again, here's the mention of Ishmael being gathered to his people, as we discussed a few minutes ago. Verse 18 talks about where they settled, and also at the end, he settled in defiance of all his relatives. That's kind of an interesting thing to note. Can you think of any reason why that would be called out?
That's part of what God originally said to Hagar, is that not right?
It is, yeah, exactly right. In Genesis 16, when the Lord is talking to Hagar after Sarai sent her away, verse 12 says, "He will be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all his brothers." So again, we have this example of God fulfilling the promises very specifically and tying off those details exactly as they were promised. Questions, comments? I know this is riveting stuff. Genealogy, right? Riveting. Okay. Verse 19. See if I can keep up with the slides this time. Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Paddan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren, and the Lord answered him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If it is so, why then am I this way?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. So Rebekah is barren. We're familiar with that from Sarah. And so we see that early on in their relationship, there's this testing, there's this struggle, this time. How long did they go without having a child or children? 20 years, right? So, we go from, the story of Rebekah being brought to Isaac, where prayers were answered very quickly, and we're almost back to kind of the way it was with Abraham and Sarah, and having to wait a long time for these prayers to be answered. But what do we see about this versus this version of the story, or this story of Isaac versus Abraham's? What's that? Isaac waited? Yeah, there was no plot on Isaac's part to try to solve this problem, right? He certainly prayed directly to God. We have record of that. We don't know that Abraham did or didn't, right? So we don't want to assume that he didn't, but he didn't try to solve the problem on his own. Significant difference there versus Abraham. And in the pregnancy itself, we see that Rebekah also calls upon the Lord, right? So going directly to God and seeking him for help. Questions, comments? I'm skipping through this kind of fast, I feel like. Anybody missing anything? Are we okay? Okay. The Lord said to her, verse 23, "Two nations are in your womb, and two people will be separated from your body. And one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." When her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now the first came forth red, all over like a hairy garment, and they named him Esau. Afterward his brother came forth with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when she gave birth to them. What do we think about the order of events here, or as the story recalls? What kind of stands out to you potentially that might be important for us to be thinking about? That's a very generally broad question.
It's interesting that the struggle in the movement, they're going to struggle throughout the history of Israel and Egypt.
Yeah, they do. They struggle in the womb, and they'll continue to struggle, right?
The rest of Genesis really going to focus on Jacob and his family, and you're going to have this transformation from Jacob, which means something not very flattering, to a new name, signifying his growth and his relationship with God, and in some way should have reflected what Israel's growth in their relationship to God should have been, but ultimately he's not.
Yep, absolutely. Jacob goes through quite a transformation, right, or growth from where we start to where we end. Anything else jump out? Just twins? Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's true. Yeah. Ask for something and you get double blessed, right? Yep. Now that's in line with the culture of the time, or out of line with the culture of the time? Yeah, it's a big difference, right? I mean, I think even through today, a lot of the times responsibility falls on older children versus the younger children. But this is a big shift here. And we see Paul talk about this in Romans. Paul in Romans 9 would use God's decision to choose Jacob over Esau to highlight that God has the right to choose who would be his people and how they would become his people. Right? It wasn't going to go through the order of culture or the order of man. It would be how God decides it to be. Romans 9 verses 8 through 13 reads, "That is, it is not the children of the flesh who are children of God, but the children of the promise are regarded as descendants. For this is the word of promise, at this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but there was Rebekah also, when she had conceived twins by one man, our father Isaac. For though the twins were not yet born and had not done anything good or bad, so that God's purpose according to his choice would stand, not because of works, but because of him who calls, it was said to her, the older shall serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated, which is a reference to Malachi chapter 1.
I think you're bringing out Malachi 1, it's very clear that God says that Esau was Jacob's brother, but I hated him and loved his brother and brought him into subjection, and he wasn't going to be successful. God was going to make sure that Edom was conquered by him.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, Kurt?
I think it's interesting that we see Jacob and Esau as capable in their own right for certain skills. I see Jacob as a quiet person, so I think about the verses of being meek and not being boastful. But then I think it's so interesting, we're going to get into it. Esau was accomplished. He was a man of the field. So he hankered so much for a meal that he was probably out there amongst the game. He could have.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about kind of their skills and maybe their professions and how relevant they were here momentarily. But yeah, absolutely.
It's interesting how much of an overwhelming sense we get of the urgency of his need when he could have, what seemed like been very difficult.
Yeah, and also the decisions that he makes as a result of his need there, right? I thought I saw a hand over here, did I? Maybe not. Maybe somebody wanted to say something, now they don't. Yeah.
I also think, I don't know if there's anything to this or not, but there's this really interesting storyline of women and infertility and God bringing life when called upon and asked, and God blessing life. And we see that ultimate life and eternal life is ultimately going to come through this family line as well. And again, I don't know if there's anything to that, but the fact that it's each generation, you see it in Sarah, you see it in Rebecca, you see it in Rachel, it's God who blesses them with life. This is a really interesting parallel to what we see in Jesus coming.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think we've talked about circumstances in which only God could have brought to fruition, right? And certainly we talk about life. I think that's a great example, a great point for us to make. Only God can bring about that life, right, that we seek. Yeah, Steve?
Verse 12 chapter says that Esau was a profane man, and it compares him with fornicators. Let there be no fornicator or profane person among you like Esau, who for one morsel of food sold his birthright.
Yeah.
So he didn't understand what was important.
Yeah, yep. And we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. And we'll see Esau's mannerisms or kind of lack of taking things seriously continue to affect him throughout his life. Great comments, great feedback. Anything else? Don't want to miss anybody. Okay. Verse 27. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a peaceful man living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. I gotta catch up, sorry. So if you've read this story before, which most of us have, you remember that each parent had a bias towards their favorite child, and we'll see in the later chapters how problematic this becomes for both of them. But to Kurt's point, I think when we maybe read this story before, it's maybe easy to picture Jacob as lazy or uninterested in maybe what's going on or uninterested in harder work, but I don't know that that's really a fair characterization. Esau had a passion around hunting and a passion for the things in the field, but that doesn't mean he was engaged in the affairs of the family. They were not hunters by trade. They were, I think it can easily be said that Jacob was probably more interested in the family affairs, stayed closer to them and the work that was being done. And I think we'll obviously see this interest clearly kind of take shape in the next part of the story. So I'm not sure I had a good view of Jacob here and what his skills were or what not. Maybe somebody used his skills for the wrong reasons or in the wrong way, but I don't know that maybe a characterization of him as lazy or uninterested in what was going on is fair. Thoughts? Anybody else read it that way? Is that just me? It's probably just me. Definitely just me. Nobody else wants to say anything. Gary, were you going to say something? Okay. All right. Verse 29, when Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished." Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "Behold, I'm about to die, so what use then is that birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So I think we have both Jacob and Esau approaching this situation poorly. What did Jacob do wrong here? Yeah.
He wanted something.
He wanted something that wasn't his? Okay. How could he have approached the situation differently? Sorry? Yeah, he did kind of swindle him, right? But Esau was kind of a willing participant.
He could have been more forgiving. He said, "Here, have it."
Yeah, he could have just fed his brother. He could have just fed his brother very simply, right? But he clearly was interested in something that wasn't his by right and was going to use this to get it. And again, I think this shows us his significant interest in the family business or the family affairs enough that he wants to claim that birthright. What did Esau do wrong? He didn't value his birthright. Was something else we could say?
He disregarded it. He didn't matter to him at all. And it was very, very, very valuable.
Right. And as Steve mentioned, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 16, some of the translations refer to him as profane, which describes someone who didn't have the proper regard for things that were important. He clearly didn't value this birthright or claim, or I don't think he would have traded it for a simple meal. What was his birthright, and what did it entitle him to?
It's basically special, and the material goes through a lot of points about this, but it's basically just a special honor given to the firstborn. They usually get like a double inheritance of what the family has, and eventually, hopefully, becoming the family leader.
Right.
If enough time goes by.
Yeah, so leadership over the family tribe and then extra portion of the inheritance, the major portion of the inheritance. This was not something small. We know that Abraham certainly was a wealthy man, and if that passed to Isaac and maintained itself in any way, shape, or form, there was a lot at stake here. And so we see Esau throwing this away for hunger. Yeah, Kurt.
We see Jacob's name too as the holder of the heel, and at this time it was part of the sport of wrestling. If you think about wrestling moving for a position, and that's the namesake of Jacob. So you could sort of see it in the way that possibly this is something that Esau had confronted Jacob with before, and Jacob finally snapped and said, "Okay, now I'm taking advantage."
Yeah. I mean, doesn't Jacob translate to supplanter, like the one who would take over, right? Or would, yeah. So this goes right with his name. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
This is something I've always wondered about.
Josh, you'd be ready for this.
Herod was an Edomian, which means Herod was an Edomite, and so were all the other Herods.
Okay.
And Jesus was a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and they were still in conflict in the New Testament until Jesus overcame the Edomian once and for all.
Very interesting. I didn't know that. Josh agrees. If anybody missed that, Josh, yeah.
Edom becomes in the prophets, outside of Babylon, Edom becomes the face of wickedness and pronouncement of God's judgment. So something that's starting here is going to carry on throughout the rest of Scripture.
Yep. And we'll see, we won't get to it in this class, but at the end of chapter 26, we won't cover it when we get to 26, but we continue to see Esau not take important matters seriously. He marries two Hittite women who, chapter 26, verse 35 say, who brought grief to Isaac and Rebekah. And so, again, we talk about choices and who to marry and whatnot, and Esau, again, fails to take this matter seriously. And brings grief to his family. And it would cause Isaac and Rebekah to make certain choices as a result of that grief that DK will go through on Sunday, right? Sunday. Hands, comments, questions? I feel like I always see one like out of the corner of my eye, and I'm never sure if I'm going to miss it. Okay, chapter 26. Again, we're not going to go through all the details of 26. But we will cover the part here with Isaac. Oh, sorry, I messed that slide up. We'll just skip that for a minute. Let's read verse 1. Now there was a famine in the land, besides the previous famine that had occurred in the days of Abraham. So Isaac went to Gerar and to Abimelech, the king of the Philistines. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands. And I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and will give your descendants all these lands. And by your descendants all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So Isaac faces kind of the same adversity that Abraham had faced early on in the story of his story, looking for relief. He finds himself in Gerar, where we run into a familiar character, Abimelech. Now, we didn't cover this before, but it's been at least 40 years since we have talked about Abimelech. And so it's possible that this is not the same person. It's possible it is the same person, but this could be a title used for the kings of Gerar, or it could be a family name that was carrying forward. So no way to know if it was the same person or not, but we'll have more interaction with him later throughout the chapter. God tells Isaac to stay and sojourn in the land. This is trading that fertile ground, that known fertile ground of Egypt, for something that is unseen or distant. Again, there was no promise of him taking these lands or getting these lands. So he's trading something on the immediate that would benefit him for something unseen in the future. And Isaac's response was he stayed, right? Verse 6, he lived in Gerar. So he was obedient, just like his father was. Now maybe I can get forward to the slides here. Chapter 26, most of chapter 26 deals with or covers Isaac's dealings with the people he lived around. So some of these stories will sound very, very familiar to us. As he moved into Gerar, we see that he claims Rebekah as his sister in order to protect himself from Abimelech. However, before she was not taken, Abimelech saw them through a window and figured out that they were really husband and wife. He calls out Isaac for not telling the truth here, potentially making, and he says, hey, someone could be guilty if they were to take her as their wife. And he responds by telling all the people to not touch either one of them as a result. So we have a very similar story to Abraham and Abimelech, right? Some similar characters here. So we kind of see, what do we see? Instead of saying it, what do we see here?
Well, it's interesting. You said that he has the same kind of faith as Abraham. In some ways, he exhibits greater faith in some things than Abraham. He prayed to God for children
Yep.
rather than taking matters into his own hand. He doesn't move out of the land. He listens to the voice of God, stays in the land. But also, from this story, he makes some of the same mistakes as Abraham. And when we get to chapter 27, it would seem makes mistakes Abraham didn't make
Yep.
as far as it comes to looking at his heirs and things. So it just kind of tells you that the struggles of one person are not going to be the struggles of the next person. And each one of us is going to have our different things that challenge us.
Yeah, and it doesn't say that they weren't people of faith, or that they weren't didn't do what God had asked them to do, right? But just maybe struggling with some of these things that could have been turned over to God, or trusting fully in God. Isaac goes on to be very successful in sowing and reaping. He reaped 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. He became very wealthy. But the Philistines there got jealous of him, and Abimelech sent him away. Verse 16 says, "For you are too powerful for us." So he left and settled in the valley. But there were ongoing disputes about wells between Isaac's servants and those who had herds there. So Isaac continued to move away from the people until there were no more disputes over wells and land. Once he does that, he goes to Beersheba, and the Lord tells him that he will bless him and multiply his descendants. And Isaac builds an altar to the Lord there. And then the last interaction of Isaac and Abimelech in this chapter, Abimelech comes to Isaac and tells him that he sees that the Lord has been with him. So again, whether it's the same Abimelech or not, it's very obvious that God is blessing Isaac. So they want a covenant with him to maintain the peace between them. So they establish a covenant there. And I believe it was the same place where Abraham and Abimelech had established a covenant there. So a place of importance for sure. So these encounters with Abimelech, again, we talked about Isaac being a man of faith, but also maybe struggling in certain parts of his life to fully trust in the Lord for protection or safety. And they really highlight his status as a sojourner, right? This was not his land. It is the promised land, but he doesn't possess it. And so he would be in conflict with those in the land. But even so, the Lord blessed him and blessed him greatly. Blessed him maybe even more so, at least material-wise, than Abraham did. So, and this was seen by others. It was clear that God was with him. So, chapter 26 in a nutshell. And then we have the recap. The last part of the chapter is where Esau marries the Hittite women, which caused pain and anguish to Isaac and Rebekah. So we went through that kind of quick. Thoughts, comments? As much time we spend on Abraham, we spend a little bit less time with Isaac. He's there's important parts of his story, but we don't really kind of move on from Isaac somewhat quickly here in Genesis onto Jacob, and I know we'll get into that transition here on Sunday and the Wednesday after. So, other thoughts, comments? Yeah, Steve.
Abimelech is, most believe that Abimelech is kind of like Pharaoh.
Yeah.
The term comes of either the Philistines or Gerar, whichever. And the name is mentioned, I think, 67 times from Genesis to First Chronicles. Not always to the kings, because Gideon's son Abimelech bring Ephraimite. But Psalms 34, David, Psalm is toward Abimelech.
Yep.
In his when he feigned madness among the Philistines.
Yeah, there's definitely some differences. If it's not the same Abimelech, then this Abimelech was a little bit more careful about not seizing Rebekah for his own. So either maybe he learned from the last one, his father, or another one who held that title, or was a little bit more cautious in his dealings with others. So definitely a kind of like a title, I think, is fair. Anything else? All right. Thanks so much for your attention and your participation. Appreciate it.